Well, the Prime Minister hasn't been in China for long, but already America is casting a huge shadow over his trip. Elbridge Colby, the man who's leading the AUKUS review, wants us to clarify if our subs purchased from the US would then help the US if China makes a move on Taiwan. It does seem a reasonable question. Anthony Albanese, though, reverting to our position that Australia wants things to remain as they are.
We support the status quo when it comes to Taiwan. We don't support any unilateral action there. We have a clear position and we have been consistent about that.
But wanting things to remain as they are doesn't mean they will be. Joining us live is former DFAT China Council scholar and our resident China watcher here, Andrew Phelan. It's good to see you on this Monday morning, Andrew. So let's break this question up into two parts. First of all, what do you make of Elbridge Colby's request? And then secondly, our response to that.
Yeah, good morning, Peter. I've got to know Elbridge Colby reasonably well over the last few years before he's gone back into government. He's the author of a book called Strategy of Denial. And the US military industrial base, as is commonly known, is not what it used to be, to put it mildly. So he's trying to boost that. But in addition, you know, China has something that Britain had at the height of its empire and then America had after World War II. It's got scale. It's got enormous scale. And in a Taiwan contingency, it would be fighting close to home and America would be fighting far from home. So it would have the home court advantage, as it were. So allies become critical because when you add the allies in, it brings an allied effort, the scale that gives China pause when she is, thinking the strategic calculus. Should I move on Taiwan? He's going to go, not today.
I did put this just as after we spoke last Friday, Andrew. I did put that question to James Patterson about this subs request because there had been a drop already. And James was like, well, it's kind of a moot point because the subs aren't going to be here until, for 10 years and China will likely make a move on Taiwan before then. So, it doesn't really matter. Do you agree with that?
I do. The fact is they wouldn't be delivered, and it's all very well for the Prime Minister to say, we want to keep the status quo. So do I. Nobody wants a war over Taiwan. But the fact is that China or Xi Jinping has made it very clear that he wants to annex or take Taiwan back into the fold of the socialist motherland, as he might say. And 27, of course, is the 100-year anniversary of the founding of the PLA. And, they're rehearsing for it on a daily basis. So, some have said, look, this is a hypothetical. We don't comment on hypotheticals. I think where Elbridge Colby's coming from is he's saying to allies, and not just us, to Shigeru Ishiba, the new Japanese Prime Minister, who's not as hawkish as perhaps his predecessors Shinzo Abe or Fumio Kishida were. Certainly that's the view of the last Japanese ambassador to Australia, Shingo Yamagami. So he's pressing them as well because we want to be as well prepared for a contingency as possible. And so Elbridge Colby is doing his job. His job is to prepare for that contingency. And, through Trump's so-called peace through strength policy to deter China from any action.
Yeah. So do you think Colby's request is strategic, knowing that our Prime Minister was heading to China at the moment?
Hard to say. I think he's been consistent over the last few years. And, to his credit, he's really sounded the alarm. He's been called a prioritizer. In other words, his top three priorities are China, and China. And for good reason, because that's where the threat is. And, you don't have to look far to see China's behaviour in the region, in the South China Sea, particularly with the Philippines and Vietnam. They're now arguing with South Korea over structures in the Yellow Sea. They're infringing on Japan's airspace on a regular basis. The behaviour is becoming more belligerent. And I'm not sure how much the the mantra or the boilerplate that's constantly wheeled out. We'll cooperate where we can, disagree where we must. I'm not sure what that actually means in practice in terms of us pushing back. And the other thing I'd suggest is it's all well and good to sell more wine and have more tourists come here. But, as the Singapore Trade Minister said back in 2020, off the record, he didn't want the percentage of trade with China to be more than 20% because he felt that China would hold Singapore to ransom. Now, I would take heed of that, Singapore being predominantly Chinese and a trading nation. I think there's some more risk of us being more exposed to the China market and less diversified. And the other thing is, I think we ought to be on board with helping the United States, both with critical minerals and helping it rebuild its military industrial base. That's in our long-term security interest.
That's true. So the Prime Minister, he wants the conversation on trade and tourism today. There's the Australian CEOs who are there with him. What do you think that those businesses will be hoping to achieve?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, all businesses are looking for incremental growth. I noticed that Albanese met with the Shanghai party chief yesterday, and in Rome he made the excuse he didn't meet with JD Vance because he was below his level, but he was quite happy to meet with the Shanghai party chief yesterday. And some of his comments where he said, well, the Chinese Communist Party's lifted hundreds of millions of people from poverty. We've heard that time and time again. It was interesting that Li Keqiang's predecessor, got himself in hot water for saying, hey, you know what, there's still 600 million people, in dire poverty in China. And that didn't sit well with Xi Jinping at the time, who was supposedly solved China's poverty problem. The other comment he made was, look at all those skyscrapers across the river in Pudong. Dong meaning east, Pu meaning the Huangpu River. So on the east of the river. Now, when I first went to China a long time ago, that was a paddock. There was nothing there. So fair comment. There's been a hell of a lot of progress in China since the opening and reform era. But what you don't see under the surface is a lot of those buildings are struggling with tenants. And the tallest of them, Shanghai Tower, the tallest building in China, for a long time it was half full and it was leaking when it was raining. So sometimes in China, you've got to scratch a little bit below the surface to see what's really going on.
Good to talk to you as always, Andrew. Appreciate that. We'll check in with you in a couple of days as this trip progresses.